afternoon. I'd say in general, this is probably going to be a little more upbeat than this morning's. So all kind of, room for optimism and where a lot of action is on any number of levels, state, local government, and tribal governments. I'm going to actually hand this off to my colleague, Professor William Boyd, to introduce our next speaker. So, William.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks, Sean, and everyone at the Gedges Wilkinson Center for organizing this event. I'm William Boyd. I'm on the faculty here, and I teach energy law and environmental law and climate change law and policy, and was not able to see the first panel this morning, but I did see the second panel of the morning, which I thought was excellent. I'm looking forward to the rest of the day. Now, I will say that we have a challenge here this afternoon because few topics make the eyes glaze over and the mind wander more than electricity, especially after lunch. But in Dave Spence's capable hands, I know we're in for a real treat here. Dave is a real hero of mine. He is currently the Herbert D. Kelleher Professor of Business Law at Macomb Business School and Professor of Law at the Law School at UT Austin. So he teaches energy law in the law school, and then he goes over and teaches a different energy law class to the business school students, and does a bunch of other things in between. He is the author of the leading case book in energy law that all of us use and have used for many years. He's a prolific scholar, and he's really just an exceptional mentor for all of us in the field. He is someone who has probably thought of just about everything that anyone is writing on in energy law. And if you dig hard enough in his articles, you can find that he's pretty much already said all there is to say about many topics, which is a little depressing at times. I think this afternoon he's really combining his skills as a political scientist and as a scholar of energy law and regulation and looking at sort of a way out of the polarization that we have in our sort of politics around energy policy and climate policy more generally. So Dave's going to give his talk for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have a little back and forth and then open it up for discussion. But we really do want this to be interactive, so please be thinking about any questions or interventions you want to make during the Q&A. So Dave, thanks.
Thanks very much, William, for that very overly generous introduction. I appreciate it. It's great to be here in Boulder. I was lucky enough to be invited to come here 4 or 5 years ago to talk about conflicts between states and local governments over fracking. And I fell in love with Boulder and the campus and never turned down an invitation to come back. So I'm really happy to be here. In the interim, my son enrolled as a student here, so it's an extra benefit for me to come and see him at the same time. I want to join others in thanking Alice and Sean and the Gedges Wilkinson Center and the sponsors for making this conference possible. It's just exactly the kind of conference I love to attend, where people from different perspectives and different disciplines are all together talking about these issues in a more sophisticated way than they're usually talked about. And so I like that. As William said, or as Alice said, actually, I think we're going to have a little more optimism was her word. Optimism is in the title of my talk today, and that's definitely the case. I'm trying to focus on the electricity sector today. I think a lot of what I say more generally is applicable to the oil and gas sector as well. But what I really want to focus on is the reasons why we might be a little bit optimistic about generally environmental progress and particularly climate progress if we take our gaze away from federal policy for a minute and look at other parts of the system. And then more generally, as William alluded to, I'd also like to I mean, it'd be great if I could do what he said, which is offer a way out of the polarization. I'm not sure. I feel like what I'm really doing is pleading for us all to try and find a way out of the polarization. But you can make your own judgment about what I'm saying here at the end. But I really am going to try to talk a little bit about the larger political and social context in which a lot of these debates happen. So I'm going to be in both of these ways at about 30,000 feet. I sort of assumed that I think it was borne out that the rest of the conference would get into the weeds on some of these regulatory disputes. And so I'm going to try and back out of that a little bit and look at this from a broader perspective. And I've sort of divided my talk into 3 parts, and some of them may seem, obvious, or, I'm not trying to be patronizing in making some of these statements, but I think these points that are obvious conceptually, we lose sight of in the heat of battle. And so I want to try and dive into why that is. And so I've broken what I'm going to say over the next 30, 40 minutes down into 3 parts. One is sort of reminding ourselves or fully appreciating in a more nuanced way the fact that markets and law, or markets and regulation, are interdependent. I think we sometimes lose sight of that. We can all sort of agree and say, of course, yes, but depending upon the frames we impose on energy law or environmental law or an environmental problem, we can easily lose sight of that. Some people think of these problems from the top down. Bill McKibben would be a good example. We have to start with a goal of not exceeding 2 degrees centigrade warming, and we reason our way backward toward a solution, and that's what we have to do. That's a top-down view. Other people take a bottom-up view, economists in particular. They think about the market and they think about individuals. They start with individuals at that level and ask, what are individuals likely to do? And so those frames clash at times, and they talk past each other at times. And I want to sort of explore why that is. I think part of that problem is much worse today than it used to be because of political polarization. So I want to talk a little bit about polarization, ideological polarization between the parties and what it does to us. It's straining our system in ways that it didn't strain the system way back when. The first panel was a sort of walk down memory lane for those of us that are my age or older. I remember back during the Clinton administration, a lot of these same problems that the first panel was talking about, sort of why are we so adversarial? Why can't environmental groups and business work together? Those were the problems that were consuming the Clinton EPA, particularly in the second Clinton administration, and they came up with programs like Project Excel and the Environmental Leadership Program that were designed to bring those sides together. That's the same, we're still hearing that same lament, and getting past it is worse now that we're so ideologically polarized. It's a tougher problem to get past. So I want to talk about that. But then I'll get to the good part, which is that I think there are reasons for optimism here. There are good things happening in the energy sector, particularly the electricity sector, if we don't focus on federal policy. So that's my basic goal here. I hardly ever give a talk without having this slide in it. Probably many of you have seen it before. It is what engineers would call a Sankey diagram that's put out by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory every year, and it's a picture of how energy flows through our economy. So on the left-hand side of the primary source fuels, don't know if you can read them, but the black one is coal, the green one is petroleum, on the left-hand side you have the source fuels, on the far right you have the end uses. In between you have some of those fuels going to electricity generation before they get to the end users. They produce one of these every year. It's not the subject of my talk, but it's really interesting to go back and look at them year over year. They go back to 1974. You can find them online, and you can see how our use of energy has changed over time. For my purposes here, I think they're a useful way of illustrating pictorially that in the market, all these fuels compete with one another. As someone said this morning, and again, it seems like an obvious point, but we sometimes lose sight of it, our energy infrastructure comes from private capital. Private capital invests in building generating facilities, transmission lines. Almost all of it comes from private investment, and so if nobody's willing to put up the money to build it, whether it's a new wind farm or a new solar farm or a transmission line to get that clean power back to market, if nobody's willing to put that money up, then it's not going to get built. And so keeping in mind that these fuels are competing with one another over time is important. They're constantly working to get cheaper, to outcompete the other one on price. Of course, we regulate that process. We regulate entry into the market through permitting proceedings. We regulate the extraction of fuels on the left. We regulate electric generation there in that box in the middle, in the top part of the middle there. And we regulate transportation and other uses as well. So it's a way of reminding ourselves of that. We don't generally, as a government, dictate which kinds of facilities will be built, and we don't force people to build them in particular locations. They have to want to do it. And we regulate entry traditionally in the energy sector through some sort of general license to build a new power plant, to build a power line. And generally, we grant regulatory agencies broad latitude to decide when to say yes and under what conditions. Their charge is to do so in the public interest, to determine what the public interest means. And over time, it's come to be, at least I conceive of it as balancing three sets of concerns: affordability, the reliability of energy, and the environmental performance environmental impact of energy. Those are each sets of concerns, right? Reliability is a lot of things. It's whether the plant's going to give you electricity when you turn the lights on. It's the latest buzzword, resiliency. It's flexibility. How fast can a plant ramp up and down? These are all elements in my world, anyway, my framing of reliability. Environmental performance is a lot of things. It's not just climate change. We heard about particulate matter this morning. That's the most deadly pollutant. It dominates EPA's estimates of the benefits of reducing pollution far more than climate impacts do. And affordability, of course. We want our energy to be provided at a price that people can afford. If it isn't, then that particularly harms poorer people. And that's something that regulators have to keep in mind. You and I, we may each have our own weighting of each of these attributes, and people in Austin and people in Boulder, I bet our average weightings are pretty similar, but they're not representative of the weightings that other people bring necessarily to these questions, and the agency has to represent everybody. They have to represent the median voter, as political scientists would say. It used to be we didn't worry about environmental issues up until the latter part of the 20th century. It was just affordability and security. And it wasn't until the latter part of the 20th century that environment came back in. And so these agencies, they make this public interest determination about whether to say yes to a new plant or not. And that the way they weight these things changes over time. In the late 70s, when we thought we were running out of energy security was a really big deal. And so even though we were starting to think about environmental issues, it might not have loomed as large as, we want there to be energy when people need it. So this another way in which this regulatory system is it's not dictating outcomes, it's just trying to channel them. It's trying to steer them. I often, with my students, use the metaphor of tugboats. The tanker is the economy and the tugboat is regulation. We are steering private decisions that are otherwise made on economic least cost bases toward particular outcomes with regulations. We're not China. We don't tell people which plants to build. We don't build them. The government doesn't build them themselves usually. We're trying to have an impact on the economy through regulation. Okay, polarization has changed and distorted the way this system works in important ways. Political scientists measure polarization and have for a while now. This picture is of the sort of diverging ideologies of the median members of each party in Congress. So the blue line are Republicans. Going up on the vertical axis is more conservative. Going down is more liberal. The middle, the brown line is the average Democrat, the median Democrat. These, for historical reasons, used to be separated into Northern and Southern Democrats. You could probably take those lines out now because they've converged. And you can see that polarization has gotten a lot worse in the modern regulatory era, particularly in the last 25 years or so. In the words of the person who manages this data set and studies this most intensely, the parties have been diverging and it's not symmetrical. Most of the movement, or 3/4 of the movement, is the Republican Party becoming more conservative. The Democratic Party's become slightly more liberal over that same period. So what this means is that each party's vision of the good in the energy world, say, of how you balance those concerns to arrive at a definition of the public interest, is farther apart than it ever has been. And it seems more unacceptable to the other side than it ever has. It makes us worry more about the other side being in power and pursuing a vision of the future that seems really, really, really bad to us. And both sides feel that way about the other. What it also means is that Congress is unable to do anything. It's gridlocked. And so because of this divergence and because the parties neither party has a big enough majority to really fully pursue their agenda, there's a lot of things they'd like to do that they can't do. When one party controls both branches in the presidency, they can do certain things, but there's other things they'd like to do, but they can't. So it leaves the states and local governments and the market, it leaves a lot of the initiative for change to them. Congress can't intervene in these energy problems that we're facing, like climate change, because they can't agree to do anything. They can't agree to oppose, sort of efforts to pursue, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they can't agree to endorse them. So a lot of the action, a lot of the interesting stuff is happening in the state level and in the market itself through individual market initiative. I should add that sort of returning to this slide for a second, I should add that part of the problem here is also that there's tension. There continues to be tension between the pursuit of these goals, environmental performance, affordability, and reliability. They're a little bit in tension with one another. At times, the degree of tension changes over time, but if you pursue any one of them too far, you jeopardize the others, and I'll explain more about that in a minute. So this polarization often creates a divergence on sort of how much you push on each one. And I'll get specific in a second to sort of explain that. It also makes us, it feeds a lot of the sort of biases that humans have. If we're super worried, if we're emotionally upset about the agenda of the other side or the other party, it affects how we behave in the pursuit of our own agenda, of our own goals. It affects how we perceive, it not only makes us upset, but it affects what we believe. It affects how we process new information, say about risk, for example. There's some interesting studies being done at Yale on how we incorporate new information about risk associated with lots of things, including energy facilities. And it turns out that we filter out the information we don't like, that doesn't confirm our initial biases or our presumptions, or doesn't jive nicely with what our friends believe, and we accept the information that more readily that does confirm our beliefs and fit with our sort of worldviews. And so the fact that that we do that, and the fact that we can do that more quickly and efficiently in the digital age, sort of feeds back into the problem of polarization. It's not just that we have different values about how to balance these different attributes of the energy system, it's that we actually believe different facts about each of these things. Is nuclear power safe? Is climate science a hoax? Is Robert Mueller a loyal patriot trying to discharge his duties, or a partisan hack? We all are being asked all the time and lobbied constantly by interest groups, by people who have an interest, to sort of believe the set of facts that serve their interests. And we have to be ever more vigilant at trying to make sure we guard against the sort of human instinct to want to accept that favorable information. And it's not just, it's not just that people are doing it to us, it's that we do it to ourselves. Our Facebook feeds now do this automatically to us, right? And so we have, it's all a feedback loop. So I'm not to the optimistic part yet, but I'm getting there. It's sort of a feedback loop here that makes this worse and worse. And I think that's why we heard some talk this morning from the industry people about passion and emotion in sort of a plaintive way. There's just sort of a lamenting sort of tone in their voices, and it's about how passion and emotion combined with these psychological biases and the ability to filter information ever more efficiently that's sort of led us to this place. And so it's always good to bring presidents into the discussion. So I'm going to bring a couple of presidents into the discussion, James Madison and George Washington. But this is not a new idea. It's something the founders were aware of. In the Federalist Papers, James Madison says exactly that our passions and opinions have reciprocal influence on one another. He sort of was foreshadowing the idea of confirmation bias, the idea that if we really need something to be true and we wish it to be true, we're more likely to believe it's true. Lately, I've seen a lot of memes floating around the internet quoting George Washington's farewell address, which is really more about populism than it is about ideology, but it's about the idea of becoming tribal in our politics and sort of each party sort of getting in power and punishing the other. We may think we're seeing some of that right now. Some of the discussion this morning kind of looks like that. And so it's easy to despair about this stuff. Especially when it gets especially ridiculous. I think the speakers in the second panel were very polite in the way they were talking about the way the EPA is trying to do what it's doing now. And I think everybody here was able to read between the lines, and I see Megan smiling, and I think Megan was being very polite in her language. Some of it's ridiculous, right? I mean, in my new energy news feed the other day, I got a story, and I brought it up just so I wouldn't get the lead sentence wrong, but it says, the lead sentence was, U.S. EPA is not releasing details of its plan to make science at the agency more transparent. So I mean, so think about that. I mean, so yes, a lot of bad things are happening when it comes to sort of environmental protection and climate change, and we have both ideological extremism and that same kind of populism that Washington was talking about on display now, and we've heard a lot about that, so I'm not going to repeat that stuff. But some of it is the product of these biases I'm talking about. I mean, I think there are people in the sort of Scott Pruitt orbit that actually believe that climate science is a hoax. And it's not just an industry hack trying to do something for an industry. It's a sincere belief, as misguided as it may seem to me anyway. And in the case of Donald Trump, I don't know what his motivations are, but certainly the messages he's conveying, we'll bring your coal jobs back. That's kind of a classic sort of populist message that sounds good and people want to believe, and so they believe it. So we're seeing some of that. We're also seeing a lot of growth in the oil and gas industry. That is, I think that's not all bad, but it has certainly negative consequences for climate impacts. And so that's what's causing people to despair. But I think some of the good news is associated with things that are happening in the market, even putting policy aside for a moment. For the first time ever, renewable electricity generation, at least at utility scale, is cheaper than everything else. That's amazing. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime. I've been involved in energy policy for 35 years, and I just didn't think that was going to happen. I knew costs were coming down quickly, but this is a picture put out by a company called Lazard that estimates the levelized costs of energy, meaning the amount of money a particular electric generating plant would have to earn on a per megawatt hour basis over its lifetime to stay in the black, to be profitable. And it's a way of comparing. If you compare those costs across different generators, you can sort of compare which is most profitable at any given point in time. The ones that are squared, the top two are utility scale solar and utility scale wind. You can see that Lazard offers a range of estimates, but the low end of their ranges is cheaper in the case of wind and right there with natural gas in the case of solar. In the world of energy want types, that's an amazing thing. I'll just use a quick information. Unsubsidized. Amazing. It does not include production tax credit or the investment tax credit. So what that means is that if you are pursuing a least cost, and let me just one caveat. This is a national average estimate. There are places where it's cheaper and there are places where it's more expensive. But what that means is that in a least cost world where economics are driving decisions, we're going to see more and more and more of these types of resources being built. People want them because it's cheapest, not just because it's clean, but because it's cheapest. And that's an amazing development. In Texas, where we have a lot of wind, we are seeing now demand from companies outside of Texas in the Southeast, which is not, there's no political demand for renewable energy or much in the way of environmental protection in the Southeast to the east of Texas, but their customers want cheap renewable power so badly that there's now a transmission project which will take power out of Texas to the east, into the Southeast, merely just to serve that demand. It's the Entergy the area, which is a big utility that serves a lot of the Southeast. And, they don't have a renewable portfolio standard. They don't have top-down pressure to do this. It's just the market. And mainly companies, big companies who consume a lot of electricity, they want this cheap renewable power. So that's a really good sign. As a byproduct of all this, I think we see some of this happening at the expense of coal, because the harm done by coal generation is so much worse than everything else. That's a good thing. Here's a picture of electric generation, shares of electric generation by fuel type over time. The top black line is coal. And the renewable line, non-hydro renewables, is the green line at the bottom. It looks pretty small, and it is, but it's growing very quickly. If we extrapolate, it looks something like that. And I think it's going to pass. Most people think it's going to pass coal generation in a relatively short period of time. I don't know what the natural gas line is going to do. That's why I didn't extrapolate there, and that's a debatable topic. But certainly, there's a lot of good news on the sort of demand for renewables front. Public utility commissions that refuse to let people build renewables are going to have to answer to their constituents. Why are you making us build something that's more expensive than that? Why don't you give us the cheapest power? And that's, sorry? That was, sorry. That was natural gas. Yeah, and if you maybe the question was motivated by recognizing that the gas line and the coal line look like mirror images of one another. Cheap natural gas has done a lot of harm to coal over time, and in some parts of the country still is doing harm to coal over time. All right. The other good news comes from the states. The states are doing things to promote cleaner energy. First of all, renewable portfolio standards are popular not just in blue states, but in red states as well. Lots of red states have mandates that utilities sell a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources. That's a good thing. The American Legislative Exchange Council has been trying to kill these RPSs or scale them back. Their efforts over the last 5 years have been pretty close to an abject failure. People like renewable power, and they like renewable portfolio standards, and they seem to be here to stay, and they're getting stricter in some places. Let me just say a word about take your picture? Okay. These slides will be available, I think, afterwards. But let me just say a quick word about 3 states and what they're doing, because there's lots of experimentation, there's lots of different things that are happening. And just to give you a sense of the variety of good news out there, I want to compare these 3 states. So California, as everybody probably knows, is a leader in sort of pushing renewables, pushing for a cleaner energy mix, pushing for decarbonization of their energy mix. So they have a very aggressive renewable portfolio standard. They have renewable fuel standards. They're pushing battery storage onto the electric grid in a big way. That's could be an expensive proposition for California ratepayers, but it's good for the rest of us because they're helping bring costs down, more development of battery technology and that sort of thing. So they're sort of paving the way for that. Texas, just totally the opposite. No top-down pressure for green power, yet more wind than almost any, way more wind than any other state, and more wind than the next 2 states combined in terms of total generating capacity. Just to give you a sense of the percentage, I think we have about 75 gigawatts of generating capacity in Texas. About 20 of that is wind right now, and in the next few years, 25 will be wind and solar. So a lot of wind and solar there. New York, what they're doing is they're trying to push a more decentralized market where they rely more on distributed energy resources like rooftop solar units and generators and other technology behind the meter at the customer location, and trying to create a situation where customers can trade with one another. The Brooklyn microgrid is sort of a famous example of this. It's an experiment in Brooklyn for this kind of what they call transactive energy, decentralized energy trading among customers. I'm not going to use the word prosumers because I hate that word, but it's for customers who are also producing energy. It's bearing some fruit. These are annual generation figures in these states. So renewables is becoming a big chunk of the generation in some places. There are lots of places where it isn't, but there are some places where it is. And if you look at shorter periods of time, the other day in the Southwest Power Pole, which is just above Texas, sort of the states that shoot north from Texas, they had 66% of their energy from wind for I forget what period of time, something like an hour or 2 hours in the other day. So it's happening everywhere. And the reason is that all these decisions about what plants to build and when to use them, which plants to use, are made on an at least cost basis. And now that wind and solar are at least cost, they're going to continue to grow in these ways. Now, the news isn't all good. My title talks about cautious optimism. There is some room for caution. There's still a lot of traditional fuels out there. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in the end to have that capacity, but it certainly isn't what California and New York were hoping for here. They were hoping to have to reduce their consumption of natural gas in California in particular. Lately, ever since the Alusa Canyon leak, natural gas is really unpopular, and so they would like to reduce their reliance on natural gas. So the question is, how do we go forward and keep advancing? For those that are interested in a cleaner energy mix, how do you go forward and keep advancing this agenda? That's another part of the caution here that I want to talk about and spend the last part of my talk talking about. And I'm gonna quote from a fictional president. That's Daniel Day-Lewis. That's not Abraham Lincoln. And the quote is from the film, not from the real Lincoln. But it's great to have passion and belief in a goal, but it's also good to understand the consequences of the steps you want to take toward that goal, right? And that's what the quote's about. In the case of the movie, it's about passage of the 13th Amendment and all the little deals that had to be done to get there, things you wouldn't necessarily want to do. When we move toward a cleaner energy mix, we have to be aware of the kind of mistakes that can happen if we're just passionate and not moving with our eyes open about the consequences of individual steps we take along the way. And these mostly have to do with those trade-offs I mentioned earlier, the trade-offs between affordability, reliability, and environmental performance. And I'm going to make another, I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but I'm going to talk about biases one more time. I hope everybody's had a chance to read either Thinking Fast and Slow or the recent Michael Lewis book about Kahneman and Tversky, which is a much more accessible way of getting at this stuff. It was a bestseller called, what's the name of that book? Michael Lewis, about Kahneman and Tversky. I've blanked on the name. But it's Michael Lewis, the guy that wrote Moneyball and Big Short and those, thank you, The Undoing Project. Great book on this. We all succumb to these things. It's so easy to see them in the other guy, right? We see these biases in everybody else, but we don't see them in ourselves. And so if we're thinking about these things, these issues as crusades, and we start to think about the other guy as doing something evil and wrong, we're going to make mistakes too. We're going to pursue, or at least we're not going to treat the truth with the respect that it deserves. This cartoon at the bottom is sort of an example of how we search for information on the internet. We look for the stuff that confirms our beliefs. And it's so the term filter bubble is a book now, and it's an actual phenomenon, one that happens on both sides of the ideological and political aisle. Let me just close with a couple of examples of places where I think people sometimes, at least not so much in the room like this, but in the popular debate, misunderstand or fail to appreciate these trade-offs. And even if everybody in this room understands them, everybody in this room goes out and works in real conflicts and real policy decisions and with people who are going to make these mistakes. And I think it's up to all of us to try and keep us all, aware of these trade-offs and not to sort of downplay them, because I think if we do, it feeds into that polarization on the other side. 100% renewables. These cities are all self-described as 100% renewable energy cities, meaning 100% renewable electricity cities. I don't know if any of them actually are. It may be one or two, but they aren't, right? They all are connected to the grid. What this means is they have entered into contracts to purchase an amounts of renewable electricity. They pay for amounts of renewable electricity that equal their total consumption. But they don't only get renewable electricity. because at night when the sun isn't shining on still days, they're getting electricity off the grid from somewhere else. And it's great. And for now, we can keep working toward this. We can keep having more and more cities become 100% renewable. We can integrate much more renewable energy than we ever thought we could. We're really getting good at it. The information technology on the grid is helping. But at some point, at some level of penetration, we can't do it anymore, right? We have to have something else backing up the renewable power, because we do have night times and we have days when we have weeks when the wind doesn't blow very hard. I grew up in Rochester, New York. One December that I was living there, the sun shone 6% of the time that it was out because of cloud cover. And that's unfortunately not atypical in Rochester. So we're still going to need other things, or we're still going to need backup. What that backup is, we can debate, but to pretend that these are 100% renewable cities, they are in one sense, but they're not in the sense that many people think of when they read the article saying that Georgetown, Texas became or Aspen, Colorado became 100% renewable. This is the high penetrations of renewables are starting to cause, or at least they're leading grid operators to anticipate problems that they'll probably find solutions to, but they're problems nevertheless. They're part of these trade-offs. Grid operators are engineers and they love to solve a problem. They don't say they can't do it, but that doesn't mean it's not a real problem. The duck curve, many of you are familiar with. This is the picture of net load in California, meaning the demand that has to be served by generators other than renewable generators. Because renewable generators are always used when they're running because they're the cheapest, but they also are subject to cutting off quickly. And in California, where there's a lot of solar, what happens is the solar is great at satisfying the afternoon peak, but the peak continues into the early evening. When the sun goes down, suddenly you need a lot of generation, that sharp part of the duck's from the belly up to its neck. I hope it looks like a duck. Suddenly you need a lot of something. In Southern California right now, it's natural gas. They've got a lot of natural gas there. And if they want to get rid of that natural gas, they're going to have to satisfy that demand some other way. I can tell you right now, no matter what you've heard, batteries that will serve, sun plus batteries that will serve that at least until the next day are too expensive. They're much more expensive than natural gas. That could change, but right now that's very expensive. These are the kinds of things regulators and grid operators worry about. That might have something to do with why California wants to expand the Western market into other states. They might want to use those other states for supply in times of need. In Texas, we have really, really low prices. We use anything but the price of electricity to compensate generators. If the price of electricity goes negative, as you see it does there in West Texas at night because there's so much wind and so little demand, and because of the production tax credit that the generators are receiving, they're willing to pay you to take their power. That means that the average cost of electricity on the grid is low, 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 great for consumers, bad for producers. And so in Texas, we're worrying about whether there's enough incentive in the price signal itself to get people to build those generators that will be there when the wind isn't blowing. And that's becoming the pressing issue in Texas right now. Another one of these trade-offs. There's a trade-off if we want to encourage distributed renewables and rooftop solar, we have to worry about how much that's going to cost. Now, this is a picture of the Brooklyn microgrid. The Brooklyn microgrid is great, but sorry, I'm looking at my next slide. This is a picture of the Brooklyn microgrid. It's great, but it's also connected to the larger grid, and it also relies a lot on gas-fired electricity from the New York City area. More importantly, there's the cost in the upper right part there of distributed solar. The bottom end is $187 compared to $43 for utility scale solar. If we're going to rely on distributed solar in New York and New England, which seems to be the case, it's a place where they can't seem to build transmission lines, so distributed solar is going to be the only solar they get, I think, for a while. That's a lot more expensive proposition. Yeah.
Do these costs, are these just bus bar, or do they include distribution and transmission costs allocated to kilowatt hours to get to the customer?
The Lazard estimates are just bus bar estimates. And there's the other entity that does this is the Energy Information Administration. Their estimates include transmission, I think, but not nothing about distribution. Okay, I'm running out of time, so let me just say one other thing about fossil fuels. Oh, we're good on time? Okay. It's just worth remembering, and I think it's been part of a discussion today already, but it's not, in some circles it's not, that climate change is not the only thing. This effect that gas has on coal is important and is saving lots and lots of lives. The best kept secret in environmental policy is that coal-fired generation kills 10,000 Americans prematurely each year. No other source of electricity comes anywhere close to that. The American Economic Review had an analysis of the dollar value of the environmental harm done by 800 different industries. This was in 2011. Nothing came anywhere close to coal, and it's because coal, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide in particular kill people. And when you put the value of a human life into the calculation, it makes coal by far the most deadly source of electricity. Now, in a lot of places, there isn't any coal left. In New England, in New York, in California, there isn't any coal left. So this effect of natural gas prices on coal is not that important there. But there are places where it still is important. It's important in Texas. It's important in the PJM area, sort of the middle part of the country. And it's important in Colorado. I looked up yesterday, this is the most recent data, electric generation by fuel source in Colorado. And your biggest source is coal, about twice as big as the next biggest source. So in places where you want to phase out natural gas, you should, if you still have a lot of coal, you're going to have to think twice about that because you might be benefiting coal. There are some people who think that's what the German Energiewende, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, you German speakers, but the policy they have of heavily subsidizing renewables, but then cutting out both nuclear and natural gas, it basically kept coal alive for a while. And it's still keeping coal alive. And so the people that model the future of the grid know that in places where there isn't a lot of coal, then you can sort of heavily push renewables and push down on gas if you want, and renewables are the main beneficiary. But if you push down on gas in a place where coal still exists in a big way, then coal might be your beneficiary, in which case you're spewing out those pollutants that kill people, and that's not a good thing. All right, so just to close, so this is just a picture of those feedback loops. I mean, I would really hope that we all sort of leave here and remind ourselves not to sort of tolerate the kind of hyperbole and misstatements of fact that sometimes seem advantageous to make in the heat of a particular battle or in the heat of a debate, but that aren't right. I hope we call our own side out on that and call ourselves out on that. It used to be, if you go to an oil and gas conference, somebody would stand up and say almost every time, we've had 1 million frack jobs and never a single one has ever contaminated groundwater. And that wasn't true then, and they had probably had a larger point about how the risks to groundwater was being horribly exaggerated by movies like Gasland, and that's right, that's true. But it's also not true to say that there was never any risk to groundwater. I don't know if Mr. Comer's still here, but this morning when he showed the picture of the seep, if that seep, I don't think he said this, but if that seep is not connected hydrologically to other waters of the United States, it's not covered by the waters of the United States rules, so let's not imply that it is. On the other side, there are lots of things being said all the time about the risks associated with particular technologies that are just not true. I mentioned Gasland. It invites the viewer to believe a bunch of things that have been proven, or that are demonstrably untrue. That people's views of nuclear power, the risks associated with nuclear power are often out of whack with the actual quantifiable risks. So if we could all on each side sort of police ourselves on this, I think that would be the very best thing. And I think the reason this matters, and this is just a summary of what I've already said, but I think the reason this matters is because, we just came off of an election that was viewed widely as a sort of right-wing populist revolt against elites. And all elites are not coastal. I mean, Austin's and Boulder, we're elites, right? We're not coastal. We're liberal elites, at least in the views of the people that use terms like that. And so to sort of to impose our view of the right balance between environmental performance and costs and reliability and sort of define that as the only right one and dismiss and other views of that balance, that's not helpful, I don't think. I think in the long run, that's going to feed into polarization and make it a lot worse, which is what that arrow is supposed to signify. And I've hit my time limit, and so I think I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention.
Over here. So we've got about a half an hour, right, Alice? So we have a half an hour. So I just wanted to offer a few quick sort of comments and maybe pose a couple of questions to Dave. Let him react and then open it up. And we will, as is our custom, call upon a student for the first question. So Michael Miller or someone like Michael Miller will be getting the first question. But we'll give you a few minutes to warm up on that and then hopefully open it up for a really great discussion. Yeah. That was a great talk, Dave. Thank you so much. So just a few quick points. One, half of all coal plants in the United States retired over the last 10 years. That was in the absence of any kind of clean power plant. Obviously, there are a lot of sort of regulations that are affecting coal plants. I think your 10,000 premature deaths per year is on the low end, but I'd be interested what Paul Billings has to say because I've seen numbers higher than that. But these are retirements that are happening. More retirements are planned. Most of the retirements that we expect to see going forward are going to be in cost of service states because that's where most of the coal plants are. And so there's a secular trend here that your charts, I think, illustrate quite well that are very important that could play into your story about market forces that we need to keep in mind. This is happening in red states and blue states. And there's a big question as to how much this trend has slowed down, if you will, or would have accelerated had we passed or had the Clean Power Plan kind of ultimately in force. And a related point to that, I think, is the regional politics of energy that comes through in a lot of your discussion, that they seem to be changing quite dramatically. I think up through the Energy Policy Act of 2005, there was a fairly predictable regional dynamic to energy politics in the United States that you could see in a lot of the discussions, and everyone on the Senate Energy Committee would always say it's all regional at some level. That seems to be changing both on the oil and gas side, but particularly on the electricity side with the growth of renewables. And I'd be curious to hear how you think that has affected or is interacting with the polarization story that you see. Third, and this is really important, there's a different structure of federalism in the Federal Power Act than there is, say, in the Clean Air Act. And so this is not a cooperative federalism model. The Federal Power Act really creates a sort of a system of dual sovereignty. And the lines have blurred for sure, and they're always being, during sort of big transitions, they're always blurring a bit and being litigated. But the fact that we have a lot of autonomy at the state level and have that particular structure of federalism that is embedded in the Federal Power Act has really been important to provide opportunity for this kind of experimentation at the state level. And I think that now looks like, depending on which side of the filter bubble you are on, that looks like a pretty good hedge against polarization and gridlock at the federal level. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think there's always a big question from sort of the institutional design standpoint as to how much autonomy and experimentation do you really want at the state level, and how much do we really need sort of big federal policy to drive this. But to the extent that you think polarization and gridlock at the federal level will continue regardless of what happens in 2020 and beyond, then having the ability of the states have the ability to continue to experiment and move forward seems very important. One product of this, though, is that you end up with a pretty complex set of regulatory models out there. And so in the U.S., in the wake of the kind of stalled out experiment of electricity restructuring after the California energy crisis, we end up with 3 different models of electricity regulation, and Dave talked about 2. We have the fully restructured model in Texas and the Northeast, where you have competitive wholesale markets and competitive retail markets. Then we have, of course, traditional cost of service models like here in Colorado and much of the Southeast and other parts of the West. And then we have these odd hybrid models, such as California, Minnesota, and others, where you have competitive wholesale markets, but you still have regulated monopoly utilities with their franchises at the retail level. each one of those models has different advantages and disadvantages, and you talked a bit about that, but you didn't say much about cost of service and the extent to which that has certain advantages or disadvantages in terms of doing certain kinds of experiments, and I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on that. And then finally, there are big challenges in these organized wholesale power markets. Texas is sort of unique in the sense that it's not regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and has been able to design its market without kind of having to deal with FERC. But there, as Dave showed, right, you've got very low prices, even negative prices at certain times of the day and the year. And you're seeing this happening in other wholesale power markets as well, as zero marginal cost resources essentially are being bid into the markets. Now, I'm no financial genius, but I know if the price is zero, you can't really make any money. And this is really compressing the clearing price in some of the auctions, which is why everybody's upset, and the merchant generators are really focused on trying to create new products and new markets for reliability and fast ramping resources and all of these other things. And so, as one person said, creating markets to solve the problems in existing markets means never having to say you're sorry. And all we're doing is creating more and more markets here, and it gets very complicated. And there's a lot of politics and potential for capture, which we tend to think of in the regulated context, happening in the market design context. And so there's a lack of kind of transparency, I think, and appreciation sometimes for what's going on because this is so technical. But in the end, what the decisions and the rules and the regulations that are created for these markets will determine which resources to some extent are eligible and which are not. And that's a hugely important thing that's playing out in different ways in all of the different markets because they all have different designs as well. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how the current Federal Energy Regulatory Commission responds to some of that outside of Texas and the extent to which Texas continues to go its own way on all of that. So I'll stop there and then give you a chance to respond on any of that, ask your own questions if you want to, and then we'll open it up, and Michael will be coming for you in a minute.
He didn't leave in the interview.
No, he hasn't left yet.
So I counted 4 questions, and I'll answer with 21 points. No, I'm just kidding. No, so the first question was about coal-fired power plant retirements, cost of service places versus competitive markets. And I think I think you said correctly that we're seeing a lot of the retirements in cost of service areas because that's where many of the coal plants are. There are some in other places as well. I think in both places, the decision whether to dispatch existing plants is still based on a zero or least marginal cost basis. And so if you have cheaper resources in the mix, those plants are going to be in the mix less often. They don't have to compete to sell power. They're still part of the regulate. They get compensated by regulation, a regulated rate, but it doesn't make sense economically to keep them on the system over time if the percentage of time that they're providing power goes down, down, down. Mm-hmm. I think more than the Clean Power Plan, I would say that the Mercury Rule probably did more harm to coal-fired power plants or hastened the closure of coal-fired power plants. If you had to pick one regulatory sort of push, I'd say it was the Mercury Rule because it required installation of relatively expensive capital equipment to control mercury emissions, and you just don't want to do that on a really old plant. And most of the plants that, the coal-fired power fleet is very, very, very old. It's still old, but it's not as old as it used to be because of the closures. And so I agree with you that you're going to still see that trend continue regardless of which type of market you're in. It is a little more desperate if you're in a competitive market and you can't sell your power, then it's an easier decision. But I think utilities still have to answer for, why are you keeping this coal-fired power, this old useless coal-fired power plant on the grid? And so I think you'll still see some of that same trend continue there. When it comes to the regional politics of all this, it's weird. I mean, in Texas, for some reason, we are very friendly to green power, and were even before it was the cheapest. We built transmission lines, we built transmission lines out to the windy parts of Texas before any of the plants were there, just to facilitate the construction of wind farms, to make it more profitable to build a wind farm out there. That's a completely sort of socialist thing to do, which is not the sort of thing you think about Texas being associated with it. So there are these, I think the answer was that we thought of ourselves as sort of an energy leader. created jobs. The people in West Texas like it. The ranchers like the lease payments that they got out in West Texas. So I hesitate to generalize about the sort of red-blue divide on this issue. There are some places that are still really hostile to green power. But as I said in my...
Where?
Well, I think still in the old Southern Company areas, the Southern Company has still not been, they've still resisted, I think, signing contracts with renewable generators. I think that would change because it's cheaper.
Well, I mean, there is a lot of solar growth in Georgia and South Carolina in particular. But,
And you know better than I. Yeah, I think there,
and Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana are not the Southeast, by the way. That's really kind of the deal.
okay.
But that's a long story.
South Carolina natives, they're have a more finely honed sense of regional boundaries. So yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for that because I don't think it's definitely mixed in ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be. Did you have another point that you thought was?
Well, I mean, so there's all this discussion in both Georgia and South Carolina over the nuclear plants, obviously. In South Carolina, they've thrown in the towel and basically abandoned the nuclear units they were building, and both SCE&G, the investor-owned utility, and Santee Cooper, which is the government-owned utility, are on the block and being sold. And there's a whole bunch of politics around this, but the companies that are basically bidding on both of them have said they're interested in retiring coal plants, building some gas, and building utility-scale solar. And South Carolina also has a pretty aggressive now kind of net metering statute in place. I think last year Georgia was 1 or 2 in terms of growth in solar, and I think there's a lot of utility-scale solar investment happening throughout the Southeast because of these cost curves. I mean, and I think Southern Company and others are probably looking at their Kemper plant investment in Mississippi and the Vogtle plants and getting very nervous going forward about whether they're going to be able to recover the costs of these failed experiments. I think we do need to recognize that we learned something from those experiments, but I think the long-term future in the Southeast is a renewables gas future.
That's a better answer than I.
Which I think is better, it feeds into the politics. The red-blue politics don't work as well anymore, it seems to me, around renewables, but that was part of your point.
So your third question was about federalism and sort of the way the Federal Power Act gives a lot of autonomy to states and what states might do with that depending upon the type of system in which they're operating.
And do cost of service states have any advantage?
I think they do. I think the traditional view is that they're worse. So historically, I think a lot of people that were in traditional regulated areas thought of utilities, investor-owned utilities, as big old stodgy opponents of renewable energy, at least up until recently, and as impediments to renewable energy. If I had a nickel for every person who called me and said, why can't we be more like Texas and just open up the market? Competition is better for renewables. I'm not sure that is an equation that works. Vermont is still a traditional cost of service state, but it's one led by people that want to push renewables. And so they're using the leverage, the PUC there is using the leverage they have over utilities to be really aggressive about pushing not only utility scale renewables, but all sorts of demand response and batteries in the behind the meter and other things that are designed to make the energy mix there greener. Mm-hmm. And you don't have that leverage over the retailer in a competitive market. And so I think it depends on the sort of mission view of the regulator themselves.
The PUC, yeah.
And so I wouldn't necessarily make that. I think there's room for experimentation under both models. And then on the zero marginal cost problem, this is sort of what I alluded to perhaps too quickly in the Texas situation. Eventually in competitive markets, so the way competitive markets work, typically wholesale markets, is that at any given increment of time during the day, the marginal cost of, or the bid of the market clearing unit, the one that satisfies the last increment of demand, is the price that everybody gets for their power. As more and more zero marginal cost units come on the system and are always dispatched first because they're the cheapest, the price people are getting over time is going to go down, down, down. And eventually you're going to have average or sort of rates that are below the average cost of supplying power, not just for the dispatchable, the traditional resources, but for the renewables too, right? And so at that point, who's going to want to build power plants to serve the peaks of demand that might suddenly occur, or the neck of the duck in California? And so you have to do something else to compensate owners of power plants to make sure that they're in the black under cost of service regulation, it was guaranteed anyway. But when you go to a competitive market, you don't have that unless you do something. And so the sort of two models, or there's actually a continuum of models, but basically you can put them in two categories. One are capacity markets, which some of these markets do. They basically hold an auction and say, how much are you willing to be paid just to be there in case we need you? We may not buy any power from you, but we want you to be available. The northeastern markets tend to use these capacity markets to try and ensure they have enough reserves. In Texas, what we're moving toward are ancillary services markets, sort of essentially creating markets for very, very short-term reserves. The capacity markets look a year ahead, 3 years ahead, or 3 months ahead. Ancillary services markets look, 5 minutes ahead, 10 minutes ahead, an hour ahead, right? And in Texas, we're trying to inject more, make it more lucrative to serve those ancillary services. I don't know if that's going to be enough of a price incentive for people to want to be there. Our reserves are dwindling. This summer's supposed to be very hot. It'll be interesting to see what happens. In places that have traditional regulation, those you're going to get your money back. So it's competition that creates this issue. And when zero marginal cost units come in, eventually, at very high levels of penetration, we have a reliability problem in a pure market.
Yeah, great.
I think that's.
Thank you. No, that was perfect. So, Michael, do we have a microphone?
He's cold
And then
calling
others,
our
we'll cold call others too
Yeah.
as we go. Yeah.
He's got to go turn it on, I think.
You just hold it for a second and then we'll turn it.
He's got to turn it on, it looks like. So
Oh, wait, no.
keep talking into it, see if it works. I think he's flipping a switch or something. Or you could just yell.
I'll just yell it. I know they like to have recordings, but I'm curious about, so I was an econ major and I'm interested in carbon pricing. And admittedly, that seems a little bit far off in the future right now. But I'm wondering if you could comment on like the interplay of carbon pricing with electricity regulation, and how do you see that working? Do you think that would work well, or what some of the anticipated problems would be too?
If you mean a national carbon tax, that's far off, but carbon pricing already happens in some ways, right? I think there's a carbon adder in the California dispatch system, is that correct?
Yeah, CAISO.
And so they add a little price of carbon into their dispatch decisions. I think they came quite close to passing a carbon tax in Washington State recently. They turned it down, yeah. When I say close, they fell short. There's, of course, the tradable carbon market in the Northeast, the RGGI market, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And there's a tradable carbon market between California and Quebec. And is there anybody else?
Ontario.
And Ontario's in that now. So I think there is a legal issue, I think, associated with that the FERC could get involved in. And I didn't say much about the FERC, but there's a question under Federal Power Act precedent about whether carbon adders are consistent with the requirement that rates be just and reasonable. I suppose if the FERC wanted to get aggressive about that, or somebody wanted to get aggressive about that, they could litigate it. Personally, I don't see why it shouldn't be, but there is some bad precedent out there, or at least bad dicta in a prior case that casts doubt on whether a carbon adder is consistent with the act. But a carbon tax enacted by Congress or states, I think would be different.
But if a carbon adder is being used as it is in the California Independent System Operator, the CAISO market, to basically sequence the dispatch in a way that then allows California to meet its clean energy and climate goals, in particular the climate goals, it seems to me it's defensible there, because FERC has said a lot about the support of state public policies, and this is a big debate there. I do think that as we move toward an expanded CAISO market, that is, if you take the California Independent System Operator, which runs the wholesale power market in California and a little bit of Nevada, and it's a FERC-regulated RTO market. If we expand that out to deal to larger parts of the western United States, it helps us solve the leakage problem, the carbon leakage problem potentially that we have with the California cap and trade problem, which is a real problem, right? I mean, they have a real leakage problem because they have 23% of their electricity coming in from out of state, and there's just no way to deal with the resource shuffling and the problems there. But a broader regional market is also tricky to run, of course, when you're bringing in a lot of traditional cost of service states, and there's a whole bunch of debate about whether California can continue to govern CAISO in the way that they have. They surely will not be able to if we want to bring in these other Western states. It would be better if the Western Climate Initiative and the states that were involved in that would step up and join California in a cap and trade program, which is a very well-designed cap and trade program that has now been extended out to 2030. And at one point, the whole idea of the Western Climate Initiative was to map the Western grid. And there were states like the state of Colorado that said, no thanks, we're not going to participate in that because we're going to wait for federal policy. Well, ain't no federal policy coming anytime soon. And so it seems to me, right, now's the time for some Western states to join together with California, because you really want your cap and trade program to map your regional power market, if at all possible, to deal with the leakage issue.
Can I just
And add one more thing, though. As the duck curve gets duckier, and it seems to be getting duckier much faster than people thought, CAISO says, this is happening like 3 years ahead of schedule from their predictions, then there really is a real problem here. And if California can't tap into broader Western regional markets on a really dynamic, ongoing basis, they're going to be curtailing a lot of renewables in the afternoon.
Ducky is it's like a Great Gatsby term. Yeah. I think of it as more like it's something you'd hear in Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
That's just ducky.
More duck.
But for law students, just sort of an idea here. One of the really interesting areas of the law where there's lots of uncertainty that makes a great exam question is the sort of boundaries between FERC jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. And a lot of the issues we've been talking about could get a lot messier if the FERC were to act like the EPA is acting. I mean, the FERC is so far has been much more moderate than a lot of the other agencies that are, any other agency that's 4/5 Trump appointees, let's say, which the FERC is. But there are a lot of these questions where the FERC could try to intervene and make things difficult for states. So far, they've left them alone for the most part, but there's a lot of pending matters before the FERC involving exactly these issues.
No, FERC has been fairly generous and accommodating of California on a whole range of things, and I wouldn't necessarily expect that to happen with this current FERC, but we haven't had enough time yet with the current commission to really know. So, other questions? KK.
It's working now. Thank you. KK to BVA, University of Denver, and David, I've used your book also in my energy classes, so thank you. My question was on your Lazard charts of levelized cost where you showed utility solar PV as competitive. How has the Trump tariff impacted that? Did that chart reflect that? And if it didn't, I'm assuming it didn't. I didn't see a date on it.
It does not reflect that. We have a fellow at the University of Texas who tried to estimate those costs. So a 30% tariff does not yield a 30% change in that number because the cells are just one part of the cost of providing that. But it does push that number up somewhere between $3 and $5. Which relates to other? Yeah, which would make it less expensive or more expensive than gas. I think it was $1 more expensive at the low end on the Lazard chart. This would make it $5 more expensive, say. So no, you're right. The Lazard chart came out last November, so it was before the tariffs.
A question down here.
But at the same time, those cells costs are still going down. We're still seeing fairly rapid decreases in costs.
I believe that new studies on the amount of fugitive methane are showing that there's greater and greater amounts. Is it possible that the use and reliance on natural gas can have a greater impact on climate than to continue to use coal?
So I would commend to everyone the EDF's suite of studies on methane leakage, and it is a suite of studies. What happens is they trickle out over, so far, about a 3-year period. And depending upon where you measure, how you measure, and which part of the system you measure, you get different estimates of the rate of leakage. There's this sort of notion that there's a magic number of 3%. If there's more than the 3% leakage, then there's no net climate benefit of switching from coal to gas. So I would recommend that everybody look at all the studies, and they're summarized in a nicely on a page that ETF maintains. I'm a huge booster of EDF. I think they do exactly what I was preaching about a little while ago.
And just for the record, a lot of those studies were done with universities and others, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
yeah.
Colorado, Texas, we're both involved. And so I don't know, but I tell my students, based on my reading of those studies, that there is not a consensus answer yet, and I don't think I've seen any EPA press release, say that there is an answer yet, but they will say that in this particular location, using these methods, we found X%, and some of them have been much higher than 3%, and some of them have been way below 1%, depending upon where you're looking and what you're measuring and how. I think when they're done, they're probably going to create a report that tries to give you a bigger picture answer, but I think you're exactly right that if the number's too high, then the climate benefits of switching from coal to gas will be negated, and it may even be worse if you don't plug those leaks. But I think the idea here is that these leaks are fairly, they're not equivalent of caulking a window, a lot of these. So there's a tremendous amount of stuff low-cost stuff that can be done if you can identify them. And the new technologies to identify the leaks are sprouting like weeds every day. And just in the last week, I read about a biological substance it's organisms that you can sort of paint onto equipment that will detect leaks when they start and send a signal. There's drones with infrared cameras. There's cars that run around with equipment. There's a lot of innovation in this. In fact, some of it's sponsored because of a contest from EDF about how to detect and repair leaks. And so I don't think that if that leak number turns out to be too high, I don't think that's necessarily the end of the story. It is the end of the story if you don't repair the leaks, and if the administration doesn't create rules that require people to repair the leaks. But I think the premise of your question, I would agree with you.
I think we've got to give Alice a chance to ask a question here. Yeah.
And we can go about an
Yeah,
extra
I think
5.
we've got room for a few more.
Yeah, we
Sure.
can go about 5 minutes extra. So I wanted to get your comments on 2 recent developments, especially in terms of cost. One is in Australia, Tesla work down there. They built a huge grid-scale battery operation adjacent to a wind farm, and then they also got a deal to install solar panels and batteries at 50,000 homes. And then recently, Excel, I don't know if you heard about this, but Excel got over 400 responses to a solicitation, and they released some of them in last December. But the most interesting thing is the pricing. So the median price bid for wind plus storage projects was $21 a megawatt. And the median price for solar plus storage was $36 a megawatt hour, and the previous lowest bid for solar plus storage was 45. So, huge reduction. So just wondering if those types of developments are, sort of hopefully looking at, being able to leapfrog ahead.
I think there's lots of room for optimism. I think when you see those numbers, what you have to do is ask, what's the size of the battery, and how long will it provide the same level of power that's provided from the generator that it's paired with? Sometimes these numbers are for amounts of storage or sizes of batteries that really can't serve the kinds of sort of permanent kinds of needs we would have if we didn't have any dispatchable resources generators available. But that's just a caveat. I think the idea that these are all coming down quickly is true, is right, and it offers room for some optimism. I don't think it's quite the same as necessarily yet as having a generator that can replace the lost generation from the solar unit or the wind unit when it's not generating. So for example, the Tucson number, which is the $45 number you mentioned, that's a battery that can provide power for about 2 hours after the sun goes down. And that's good, but after that it can't provide anything, and neither can the solar generator. And so we just have to do an apples to apples comparison. But I do think it's very possible that it might leapfrog.
It's an important 2 hours.
Yeah. And don't forget, the other sources are also competing to get cheaper at the same time. So there's people I know people who are optimistic that carbon capture attached to a natural gas plant is going to be affordable sometime in the next 10 years due to technical advances. I have no idea if that's right or wrong, but
But one more thing on this too. This is another example where you see some important state experimentation happening primarily in California. You know, the California legislature and the PUC have been pushing storage for a while, and the new FERC rule on storage essentially piggybacks on what was already happening in California. And so we're running some experiments in the states, seeing what works, what doesn't work, learning from that, and then potentially scaling it up to the federal level. There'll be some jurisdictional issues around this for sure as we get further down the road. One, maybe two more. Let's see right here. Oh no, Shi Wang, another student. Maybe we can do both of you guys.
Hi, I'm C. I'm actually from the Department of Geography, so this is a little bit more of a social sciencey question. So in your talk, you had sort of mentioned that the cost of especially utility scale renewables, non-hydro renewables have come down so much, especially in Texas and in Southeast, that the market is pushing for the installation of more capacity in that way. And so we kind of skipped over a lot of the talk about like federal policy and the RPS. You said even in like non-RPS states, there's incentive to build renewables. I'm just wondering what your thoughts about the role of planning is, long-term planning, like in the form of integrated review plans in pushing for renewables. And then I'm just going to tag along this question because I'm kind of curious. So what incentivized Texas to build those transmission out to the west before the wind turbines were built? Was that like as a result of planning or something else that was going on there?
So in states that have integrated resource planning proceedings for acquisition of new generation, I think it's, you know, with these new cost numbers, it's going to be very hard to avoid choosing renewables. So I think that's what you're suggesting here, is that integrated resource plans, which is a formal process of assessing all the alternatives and choosing the best alternative according to the criteria that the state uses. This is a state level thing. That's partly why I'm so optimistic about renewables in cost of service areas, because some of those have IRP processes that are just it's going to be hard to say why you didn't choose the cheapest option, especially if it's environmentally better. As for Texas and the so-called CREZ lines, that's what they're called, Community Renewable Energy Zones in West Texas. I've read histories of, and I was there for this too, but I've never really had a very satisfying explanation for why we chose to do this, at least one that I have never had a satisfying explanation that's consistent with any ideology that I associate with the legislature of Texas. It just seemed to be, you know, I think it coincided with the deregulation of the retail market, the movement to competition. And there was concern at the time about renewable energy losing out in a competitive market. But that doesn't necessarily say why we would build these transmission lines and make all the ratepayers pay for them instead of making the people who use the lines pay for them, which is what's true almost everywhere else. I wish I had a good answer for your question. The best I can come up with is that we wanted to be an energy leader. And there was a lot of bottom-up support for it in West Texas.
I think we were going to go one more very quickly, and then we've got a break so we can also have conversations with David at the break. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a little futuristic, but a couple of years ago there was a very good lecture at CU. If I have the name right, Sandy McDonald and some people from NOAA have done detailed studies of a large solar wind, actually US-wide area, which reverses your ducky curve because the sun shines someplace, the wind blows someplace 24 hours a day. So if you have the right infrastructure, transmission line structure to connect everybody, it levels the time, takes away the time problem. I wonder, have you heard anything about that? Does it go any place? They've done really extensive studies of both the market, economic aspects as well as in engineering.
I think it's a technically possible thing to do.
In the broader CAISO market.
Yeah, so there's a guy out at Stanford named Mark Jacobson who promotes an idea like this, and it's I think It's a technically possible thing to do, and one of the big sticking points is what you just said in your statement. Your question was if you can build all the transmission to connect it. Has anybody here ever been involved in a transmission siting proceeding? It's really, really difficult to do politically, and there's also there are critics who have criticized the sort of parts of his study, but you can certainly come pretty close if you build the right mix of things. It involves building hydro for storage. That has environmental opposition. It involves building a lot of transmission. But I think it's possible. I just don't know that it's economically and politically possible.
A lot of existing transmission systems as well, a kind of feeder.
You need a lot more, and you need redundant wind and solar to charge your batteries or to charge your hydro storage units or whatever storage you're using. And the one big thing is I think you also have, periodically, you do have wind, not very often, but wind droughts that last for days. And so you'd have to deal with that or have something available to deal with that.
So I think we got to leave it there. Please join me in thanking Dave Spence for an excellent keynote.
So why don't we plan on being back in here at exactly 10 till? All right? Thanks.
Thank you.
Meryl got her PhD at the Energy and Resources Group at Berkeley, but she said, be careful. She knows her shit.
One thing I wanted to let you know, we got 4 spots available so far for dinner. I never heard from Connie Rogers, so you could just invite whoever.
Hey, how are you, William? Nice to meet you. Yeah. I know it's been a long, hard slog, right? I mean, so I've been, as an undergraduate, just all different environmental stuff, and then I went to grad school in the energy and energy research programs at Berkeley, and then started practicing law and energy after that. Here I am.
Okay, that sounds great.
So I think energy policy is what's kind of discussed and debated in multiple countries that then translates into new energy laws or new laws and regulations. That's the way I think of it. So policy is prior to law. Right? So policy, think of policy as all the discussion about what should we do about climate change, what should we do about air pollution, what should we do about this, that, and the other, and that has to translate into specific laws like, Clean Air Act.
Girls are getting big.
As it's different initiatives on the
5, yeah, almost 3 and 5 now.
Yeah, that's
One's in school, the one goes to preschool next
changing
year.
electricity markets, pricing issues in the electricity markets, climate change stuff. Yeah. It's all up on my website.
I looked into it. It was like a lot of
Yeah.